Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to be sharing about the 34 books I was able to read in the month of April. It was a very good reading month, in part because I was able to take a day or two off of work. Of course, I filled it with reading, and I also had jury duty, which also allowed me to have some extra reading as well. But without further ado, let's dive into what I was able to read, and definitely some new favorite authors this month. So that was really exciting to find some new folks. So the first book that I picked up, actually the first couple of books that I picked up were by John Marrs. So this is an author that I have read recently and just loved. And I picked up his book called The Minders, which is basically about, it takes place in Britain, and the general premise is like technology security has gotten too lax, and so they start to put kind of state secrets in people's brains, and they're storing state secrets in like 5 different people's brains. But then somebody figures it out and they start to go after those 5 people. And so it's definitely set in kind of the futuristic world of John Marrs that he often, brings into play, like new technology and advanced technology. Really, really like that one. And then I picked up another book by him that is also kind of set in a bit of a futuristic society called Her Last Move, rather. And this is a police procedural about a woman detective who is partnered with a man who has this ability to recognize people. Like he could look at a crowd and like memorize all of their faces and then be able to like remember them in a different setting. And so he looks through like mugshot books and then can go out in the world and like find people who are like fugitives. And so they partner together to work on a serial killer case. Also really enjoyed that one. I also picked up the next couple of books in the Stillhouse Lake series by Rachel Kane. And the premise of this series is that there's a woman whose husband is a serial killer, and she doesn't know that he's a serial killer. And in the first book in the series, she finds out. And of course, everybody kind of suspects that she knew what was going on with her husband being a serial killer, and she doesn't. And then throughout the series, she becomes almost like a private investigator and helps other people to solve crimes. So the third book in the series is Wolf Hunter River, and I picked that one up this month. And then I'm also just scrolling ahead here. I also picked up the 4th book in this series, which is called Bitter Falls. And I picked up the 5th book, Heartbreak Bay. So I was able to get through all of those in the month of April, and really enjoy kind of where this series is going. Basically, the woman who's the wife of the serial killer has a couple of kids, and they're kind of growing up throughout this series as well. And their family is kind of dealing with the aftermath of this trauma. So always kind of interesting plot lines there. I also picked up a cute little novella called The Sweet Spot by Anne Kemp. This is the first in a series called Love in Lake Lorelei. And this was basically about a girl or a woman and a man who went to high school together, and then they get kind of thrown back together working on marketing for a food truck, like a donut food truck. And they had kind of liked each other in high school, and then they come back together as adults and obviously end up in a relationship. So that was very cute. And I also picked up Float Plan by Trish Dollar. And you may remember from my TBR video for April, I was trying to get through a lot of Kindle Unlimited books that I had on kind of my backlist, and I wasn't necessarily reading them as much as I wanted to. And this one falls into that category. Sweet Spot also falls into that category. And the Stillhouse Lake series also falls into that category. Several things that are available on Kindle Unlimited. And Float Plan is basically the story of a woman who loses her partner, and he dies, and she wants to take this kind of trip on a boat around the world because that was what they had originally planned to do together. And she finds out that she has to basically hire someone to come with her to help her on this trip. I felt like this book, it has kind of an interesting premise, and I liked it. I thought the character development made sense, but I guess I was looking for like a little bit more detail about like the actual adventure of the trip itself. I felt like this was way more focused on kind of the relationships and not the details of like what would it take to, sail around the world, which is kind of interesting to me. So that was an interesting one. Okay, then I picked up the first book in the Aurora cycle, and it is called Aurora Rising by Amy Kaufman. And this is basically a book about kind of like a ragtag group of, I don't know if they're kind of like, they're not astronauts, but it's basically kind of like a futuristic world in which people are trained for space missions. I guess they're a version of astronauts. And but everybody kind of gets trained for these missions. So it's not kind of the special thing that we think of with like NASA now. It's like everybody has these different trainings. And this group gets kind of like thrown together because they aren't chosen for like the better missions. And so they all kind of are like put together in this like group of leftovers, basically. And then they go out and they're on a mission. And then there's some kind of like, I don't want to say like confusion, but it's basically like they think they're going for one mission, but there's kind of this like other secret mission that is also part of this. And they're having to kind of like try to connect the dots between what's happening, you know, with these missions that they thought it was one thing, but it really turns out to be something else. I believe this is a trilogy. We'll probably pick up the next book in this trilogy as well. Okay, then I stumbled upon the next book. It is called After the End by Amy Plum. It is one of 2 books. I also got to the second one later on this month, which I'll talk about in a second. So After the End, I think I stumbled upon this because I was searching for something else within my library catalog and it just looked interesting. And so I clicked on it. And it's basically the story of a young girl who lives within kind of a society that's very isolated, and she's been basically told that they're isolated because of World War III and that they needed to kind of like take themselves off kind of out of society as a like survival tactic. But then she finds out that there was no World War III, and there's actually this other reason why this group has been kind of separated out from society, and somebody comes after this group basically and is trying to capture this group. And I don't want to get into too much detail as to why, but there's kind of like a little bit of like a magical element to this, or like a paranormal element to this book that I found really interesting. So basically you find this girl kind of coming to understand like the bigger reason of what was happening, and then having to kind of like come to terms with that, you know, with her family and what she was told and what she was not told, you know, about their situation. So the first book is called After the End. The second book is called Until the Beginning, and it basically continues the story of what is happening, you know, with this girl, and then it wraps up, you know, after that second book. I really enjoyed it. I was not expecting to. I think this is kind of basically like a YA apocalyptic book, and not necessarily dystopian, but because of what this girl has been told, it's a little bit like post-apocalyptic, and I really liked it. So would recommend that one. I also picked up the 4th book in the ITIN's series called JASPER VALE, and this is a book that is basically, or a series that's basically following a bunch of interconnected characters who are having romances in a small town in Montana. And in this story, this is a fake marriage story where 2 people get married in Vegas and then are kind of like deciding to stay married for various reasons. And this is how their romance begins. I liked this. I feel like the books in this series, I appreciate that all the characters are interconnected, because there's some characters that I kind of liked more than other characters. Like the first book in the series I really, really enjoyed, and the other ones have been kind of up and down just depending on the characters in the storyline. But glad to continue that series. Okay, then I picked up a nonfiction book called The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs, A New History of a Lost World by Stephen Brusate. I'll just say I was hoping to be fascinated by this book, and I was not fascinated by this book. I think in part because it was very scientific, and as it should be. I mean, it's written by an academic, it's written by a scientist. There were a lot of kind of terms and dinosaur names and names of eras and different kind of, you know, layers of kind of science that were built into this book, that I feel like if I had had even like a smidgen of knowledge about dinosaurs, it probably would have helped me to understand what was going on. But I have like no background in dinosaurs. This is something I've not really looked into. I'm certainly interested by it. I've read Jurassic Park, but that's really the extent of my knowledge, which, as we all know, is not necessarily accurate. So I feel like if you are interested, if you are like a science reader, like you like reading nonfiction science books, I would definitely recommend it. I feel like it was very well done, but I also feel like just because I had so little knowledge to start with, it just kind of went over my head. Okay. Then I picked up a couple of books in a series that is about, well, it starts out about kind of a foster family And then it branches off into kind of a relationship. The second book is about kind of a couple that's connected to this foster family, but is not necessarily involved in fostering children. So the first book is called Next of Kin by Hannah Bonham Young. I loved this book. I loved the premise of this book. I loved how it was executed. Basically, the story is you have a girl who is kind of a foster child herself, and she finds out very early in the book that her mother, who she's kind of estranged from, is giving birth to another baby. And she is in her, I think, kind of her early 20s, and her biological mother cannot take care of this baby. And so she's asked if she wants to foster her sister. But because she is kind of like a freelancer and kind of works on her own, there's concern that she's not going to have the financial stability. And so the premise of this book is there's this like new program through the foster system that connects people who are trying to foster but like need a partner in order to do it. And not like a romantic partner, but more like they can share housing, for example, and like that will stabilize their income to the degree that they're allowed to foster. So she's trying to foster her sister, and then there's another man in the book who's trying to foster his brother, who happens to be deaf, and they are trying to live together in an apartment so that they can provide kind of like the space and the care that is at the level of what will be required for this foster system. Of course, they have a romance. One of the things I wasn't expecting about this book, but that I really enjoyed, was kind of this layer around deaf culture. The woman who's fostering her sister, her adopted family, has her father who is deaf, and so she knows how to sign, and she's able to kind of sign with the two brothers that move into her apartment. And I really, really enjoyed how this author basically sets up a story that you are like rooting so hard for all of these people to win. Like you really come to believe in their lives, their story, their family, and you're really, really wanting it to work out for them. So then, of course, I had to pick up the second book in the series, which is called Next to You. And this is about the girl who fosters her sister. It's about like her best friend who is starting a relationship with the best friend of the guy who is fostering his brother. So it's kind of in their friend group. And again, another kind of story where it really sets it up where you are just like rooting for this relationship. I would love to see more from this author. I think these are the only two books in this series so far. Definitely like a new favorite series for me. Just loved how it was executed. Highly, highly recommend that one. Okay, then I picked up another John Mars because I'm working my way through his backlist, and I picked up this book called Keep It in the Family. John Mars, one of the things I find really interesting about him is he just like shifts in between genres. So he had like a police procedural, he has things that are kind of speculative fiction, and then he also has these books that I would just say are straight up horror books. And I have read a previous book that I would put into that category. This one I would also put into the category. I am trying to remember what I can actually share about this so that it doesn't get spoilery. But basically, there's a man and a woman who buy a house and they discover that there were crimes that were happening based on some evidence that's in the attic of this house. And nobody kind of knew that this was going on. And the rest of the book is basically flipping between different perspectives of trying to understand like the evidence that is found. I'm not even going to go into detail about what it is. And what it means for, this family and this couple, and they have a baby and they're trying to kind of like, build a life together. I really liked it. I've liked all of these books on audio. I typically get them on audio, but this is definitely one that like it ends in a way that's like very, very creepy. And some of his books are just like that. So depending on what you like, but I would definitely recommend it. John Mars, I feel like I've only got a few left in his backlist, and I will definitely be reading all of his books as they come out. Definitely a new favorite author for me. Okay, then I picked up a book called One True Loves by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is a book that I picked up because it has recently been adapted into, I think, a show or a film, and so I was kind of curious about what it was about. This is basically a book that is very similar to the plot of Castaway. So if you are familiar with that film, there is a woman and a man who are in a relationship, and the man basically is in like a helicopter accident, and we know kind of from the start that he's going to come back, but there's a large portion of the book where he is gone and assumed dead. So it's not a spoiler to say like he reemerges, but he reemerges, and when he reemerges, the woman that he was married to has moved into a different relationship. And so this is basically about her trying to figure out what to do because she has already like grieved him and now he's back. And she's in this other relationship with this man that she's also in love with. This is kind of like the aftermath of Castaway, which is a film about a man who is on a deserted island and then comes back, and the person he was in a relationship when he left has moved on and has married someone else. I really loved, at one point I was like, how is this book going to resolve itself? Like, how can this not just be completely heartbreaking for everybody involved? And I loved what the author did with this book. I'm interested in seeing the adaptation. I'm pretty sure I'll like the book more than I will like the movie, but highly would recommend this one as well. All right, then I picked up a book called Fable by Adrienne Young. This is book 1 in the Fable series. The next book I think is called Namesake, and there's maybe another one in the series as well. And this is basically a book about like traders and on ships. And this girl is kind of abandoned by her father on this island, and she like works her way off the island and is trying to get back to a place where she can like work on his ship. In some ways, this reminded me a lot of Robin Hobb, Live Ship Traders, which I read last year, I think, or early this year. And this felt to me, I won't say it was like a knockoff, but it was very similar, just in kind of like tone, theme, genre to what you would read in like Robin Hobb. I will continue reading this series, but I feel like if I'm going to make an investment, I would probably go more the Robin Hobb route than I would the Adrienne Young route. The Adrienne Young route is, I think, a little bit more YA focused, whereas the Robin Hobb is a little bit more kind of like adult fantasy, but with like similar themes and setting in terms of like ships and trading and those kinds of things. But I'm glad I tried it out because tons of people have talked about it, and I wanted to kind of get a sense of what it was, and I really went in cold. I didn't have a whole lot of idea of what it was about. Okay, then I finished Pride and Prejudice, which I had started last month and continued into April. And I, of course, had completely forgotten that I had already read it. So apparently Goodreads told me that I have read it previously. I thought I was reading it for the first time. But I have seen so many different adaptations of Pride and Prejudice, from like the miniseries to the films. I know the plot in and out. Like I would not have been able to tell the difference of like reading the book and watching the films, because often the films are very true to the book itself. And I read this book through an app called Serial Reader, which basically gives you like a little snippet of classics to read every day. And I had loved reading it that way because I could just kind of like dip in and out of it. And that was a really fun thing to add into my reading over the course of April. Then I picked up All Systems Red, which is the first book in the Murderbot Diaries series by Martha Wells. This was also kind of a novella, like it was relatively short, and basically about AI and the relationship between artificial intelligence and humans. I feel like this book, while I enjoyed it, was very kind of like more intense science fiction than what I usually read. And maybe I'll pick up the next one in this series just to kind of see what I think about it. I thought it was well done, but I feel like sometimes like science fiction is just like, it's not for me. And it doesn't mean it's not good and that it's not for other people, but it's not necessarily for me. And this one, I felt like because of its like technical nature, it wasn't as much for me. But I would still highly recommend it if you like science fiction that takes place in space that covers things like speculative fiction around artificial intelligence. Okay, then I picked up a book by Lynn Painter called Mr. Wrong Number, which is basically about a man and a woman where the man like accidentally calls this woman and thinks she's someone else and starts a texting relationship with her where they start to kind of, you know, be attracted to each other. And then they find out that they actually, well, he finds out, she doesn't find out yet, that they know each other in real life. And they're actually living together because she is the sibling of his roommate. I found this book to be fine, but I feel like the premise of it, of like randomly calling a number and it happens to be the person that you're living with right now, that you have had a crush on since you were a child, like, okay. I mean, like some of these romance books, like the way they throw people together, it's unbelievable and it's meant to be unbelievable and you're just supposed to kind of like go along with it. But this is one that I just felt like was maybe a little bit too unbelievable of like how the timing of this would work out. And it's not like a setup. It's just like, this is randomly something that happens to them. But I actually read this book because there's a second book in the series that just came out that I had heard good things about. And so I wanted to read the first before I moved on to the second. So I'm gonna read the second anyway and see what I think about it. But sometimes it's like you got to get through the first book. It's like the pilot of a TV series. Like it's not always going to be as good quality, and then you move on to the next one and you really enjoy it. So I'm going to try the next one from the author and see what I think. All right, then I picked up The Atlas 6 by Olivie Blake, and this is the first book in the Atlas series. It is basically about people who are chosen to be part of kind of like a magical society, and there's like a limited number of them that get brought in to kind of like audition. And of the people who are brought in, only a certain number like continue on to the next level of being in this society. This is a book that there's definitely a twist towards the end. I was not expecting it. I would definitely continue to read the second book in the series, and I already have it kind of ordered on audio from my library so I can check it out. It reminds me a little bit of like other books I've read, like Middle Game would be a good example. By Shannon McGuire. That's basically kind of like, or even The Rook. I don't remember the author's name, but like that. It's basically like contemporary magic that is for adults. It's almost like Harry Potter for adults. Dark academia, magical world. So if any of that is kind of like, you know, checking your boxes, would definitely consider checking this one out. I liked how it kind of builds on itself throughout to a point where when you have the twist, I just wasn't expecting it. But the way that the twist happens, it makes complete sense, you know, like for what's going on in the plot and what's going on in this world. All right, then I picked up another Kindle Unlimited book, Funny Feelings by Tara DeWitt. I really liked this book. It's basically about a woman who is a professional comedian, and she starts to become even like more professional. She's getting kind of like picked up by other comedians who are like very well known, and they're touring together. And as part of the tour, she needs to kind of like, well, what they recommend that she do is be in a relationship with her manager, who is a former comedian that's like very famous and everybody knows who he is. And the idea is just to kind of like build up buzz for this tour that they're all going to be going on together. But she has had a very long-standing relationship with him and with his daughter, because he's been her manager for several years. And interestingly enough, the daughter also happens to be deaf. There's kind of an interesting theme in the books this month. And she also knows sign. And so she's had this kind of relationship with their family for years. And they start to basically fake date. It's a fake dating premise. And they start to have a relationship with each other. I really liked this one. The whole concept of it was basically like being yourself in a relationship. It as an adult can be very hard, and like sometimes you feel like you're too much, and the idea here is like this woman comedian is like too much, but she's like fully accepted by this person who's known her for a long time, and they've developed this friendship over time, and that kind of blossoms into a romance. So I really like that one. Okay, then I picked up a book called Matched by Ali Condi, and this is part of a, I think, trilogy, YA dystopian. And I picked this up because somebody was talking about it on Instagram and how they wanted to revisit it because they like read it when they were like an adolescent or a teenager, and it was like for nostalgia reasons they wanted to go back to read it. And I was like, I have no idea what this series is. I've never read it, but it's kind of like, I think along the lines of like, you know, like not as sophisticated, but like The Hunger Games or The Giver, or, you know, these kinds of books that are kind of series that you might read, you know, at a certain age. So I went back and read the first one. I'll probably read the other two just to like round out the trilogy, but it's basically a story of a society where you get matched with another person in the society to be your romantic partner. And you find this out when you're like 16 years old. And the girl goes through the ceremony, the main character goes through the ceremony to be matched, but she's given kind of like her match and then like this other like false match. And the false match is like a mistake. She's not supposed to have seen it, but she knows who the person is. And then she kind of starts to develop feelings for the false match. And so there's this kind of like interesting triangle happening between her and these two boys. And she's starting to kind of like understand some things about the society that are not pleasant, you know, in terms of how it's being built in terms of rules and things that she may not want to follow as she gets older. It's very similar to The Giver, if you're familiar with that quartet, in terms of like themes and tone. So I'll probably pick up the next two just to kind of see what I think there. All right, then I read Paul Tremblay's The Cabin at the End of the World, another book I picked up because it's being adapted And I just wanted to know what it was about. Paul Tremblay often writes like horror books, and I don't read a ton of horror, but I'd heard enough about this one that I was kind of curious about what's going on. And basically it's the story of a family that is a gay couple and their daughter, and they're in a cabin in the woods, like on vacation, and they get approached by this small group of people and basically told, you need to do certain kinds of things, which I won't go into detail about what they are. If you do these things, you'll save the world. If you don't do these things, you won't save the world, and the world is gonna like implode. And it's a weird premise. Obviously, as I'm describing it, but it's basically about kind of like human nature and like, what are people going to choose, in the set of choices that's in front of them. I've already heard that the adaptation does not end in the way that the book ends. So if you're curious about the adaptation, you might consider reading the book just to kind of see what happens in the book, and then you can go see how it was adapted. This was fine. I think that it's kind of an interesting thought exercise of like what would happen, and it's kind of one of those things that makes you think like, if I was presented with this choice, what would I do? So that's kind of interesting. But for what it's worth, if you like horror, you'd probably like to pick that up. All right, then I picked up Nora Roberts' The Awakening. This is the first book in the Dragonheart Legacy series, which is basically about a young woman who finds out as an adult, as like a early 20-something, mid-20-something, that her mother has been hiding a fortune from her that her father has left her, that's like millions of dollars. And she's basically like a poor teacher with, drowning in student loans and all kinds of things. And then she finds out she has millions of dollars. So she quits her job and goes to find out about her father. I don't want to give any spoilers away, but I'm pretty sure that it's kind of like in the high level plot you get at the back of this book, that she finds out that he's part of this kind of like magical world, that when she goes to visit him, she like enters into this magical world, and like dragons are involved, as you can hear from the Dragonheart Legacy series title. I thought this was pleasant. I didn't feel strongly that I needed to like fully engage with this series to really feel like a sense of satisfaction of like how this wraps up. But like the world building and kind of like how this starts out, I would call this very like fantasy light in terms of like world building. If you're someone who's like, I don't know that I like fantasy, but I'm kind of curious about it, you could start with something like this, and it would probably be relatively easy, to engage with. All right, then I picked up a book called Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds by Adrienne Marie Brown. This is basically a book about community organizing and how to do this in a way that is kind of aligned with like social justice initiatives and other kinds of like values-based priorities that you might have as a community organizer. Kind of outside the realm of what I would normally read, but definitely something that's of interest to me. Very focused on kind of feminist ideology, and the person who writes it, I think, is clearly very experienced in this space. This is another book that I felt was a little bit over my head in terms of just like, I haven't done a ton of community organizing, and so like there were probably things that she was talking about here that it was harder for me to apply it to kind of my current experience and my current job. But I can tell from the book that she's brilliant. So if you're anywhere near, kind of like community organizing and you want to engage in some of those different kinds of ideas and open up your mind about that, would definitely recommend this book. Okay, then I picked up And Then There Were Nuns, Adventures in a Cloistered Life by Jane Christmas. And this is a book that I will give a trigger warning for sexual assault, because it is discussed in this book. And that may be a little bit of a spoiler, but I think it's just important to note that it's part of why the author is like pursuing the route she's pursuing in terms of looking into becoming a nun. What I find interesting about this book is there's basically a woman, it's a memoir, who is getting engaged to this guy. I think this is like her third marriage. And this triggers her to be like, do I want to get married or do I want to be a nun? And this book is basically about her exploring this question for herself of like whether she wants to enter into this relationship or become a nun. And of course she has these concerns that this guy who's proposed to her is going to be like out the door once he realizes she's doing this deeper dive into, becoming a nun. But I found it to be really interesting. And it's basically about like her journey of like talking with other nuns, living in different spaces with nuns where she's kind of like trying to understand the lifestyle and what draws her to it and what is maybe like too constraining about it for her. I thought it was really interesting. It's kind of a view into a world that I didn't know very much about. All right, then I picked up a book called Love at First by Kate Claiborne, and I had read another book by this author called Love Lettering, which I really enjoyed and found it to be kind of a more complex plot and a really kind of complex romance that was fun to read. This book, I would say, was more of a straight up romance. It wasn't as complex, which means I did not enjoy it as much as the Love Lettering book that was the previous one I'd read by her. Basically, the premise of this is there's a man and a woman, and when the man was like a teenager, he goes to visit this apartment building of a family member, and he hears this girl on a balcony. And then like years and years later, he inherits this apartment building, and he runs back into the girl, now grown into a woman, and he recognizes her voice. Like he'd never seen her, and she didn't see him, but he like remembers her from this time when he was a teenager, and had kind of like, it's hard to say that he had a crush on her, because he like encountered her like one time, and she was like on this balcony, but they end up having a relationship, and she's kind of trying to like save this apartment building. He's considering selling the apartment building, so it's a little bit of like an enemies to lovers kind of trope. I mean, I thought it was, again, fine, but there wasn't any kind of extra layer of like the other book. I felt like had this like interesting like twist, and like there were some cool things that the author was doing with like the complex nature of the relationship that I didn't see as much in this book, but would definitely recommend it if you are interested in kind of an enemies to lovers trope, and that's something you would enjoy. All right. Okay, so a few more here. I picked up Amari and the Night Brothers, which is the first book in the Supernatural Investigations series by B.B. Alston. This is one that I had actually read quite a bit about. People really like this series. It's kind of like a Harry Potter-esque storyline, where you have a girl who is invited into a like magical school. And when she gets into the magical school, she realizes that she has like a different kind of magic than the other people in the school. And this actually causes some challenges for her. She also happens to be an African-American girl. And this is definitely part of the storyline of like how she's accepted into certain schools or certain communities because of her racial identity. And I can see why this book is very popular, and that it is offering like the perspectives and the kind of reflections of a young adult character that maybe we don't often see in these kinds of settings. You know, I think a lot of young adult literature is not necessarily diverse, and that we don't have like a young African-American Harry Potter-like character. I thought this book was great. I love the development of the characters. I love the plot line. I love the kind of, there's kind of some like magical tests and things that are happening throughout this book. Would definitely pick up the next book in the series and just kind of see where it goes. Okay, then another John Mars that I picked up called When You Disappeared. This is a book that is kind of like a domestic drama. I don't want to say it's a domestic thriller, but kind of, in that you have a woman who is married to a man, and one day the man disappears and she doesn't know why. And basically throughout the book, we go back and forth in time between the woman and the man, and the current day and the past, to kind of, until the past and the current day meet, and we kind of understand why it was that this man disappeared. And he comes back to her like 25 years later, and they have this conversation, and she's like coming to understand kind of his rationale for leaving, and like what has happened to him in between when he left and today. It's a little creepy. And I would also say there's some trigger warnings here too. I don't want to say what they are for, because it will give away some plot points. So you might take a look, you know, if you have some concerns about the trigger warnings for this book. It all wrapped up in a way that made sense, but I would say the ending was kind of difficult, because there were kind of some disconnects, or as you can imagine, like she doesn't understand why he left for reasons that don't necessarily make sense to her. And so when you find out kind of like what they were both thinking on either side of this thing, which is like slightly off for each character, it's just kind of sad. Like, I mean, there's kind of this sad story that you're just like, oh, like it didn't have to be that way kind of thing. So it's a little bit of like, it's relatively fast paced, because you're like trying to figure out what's going on, you know, with this particular couple and their past history. But yeah, it's definitely like one that I would recommend. I'll recommend pretty much any John Mars at this point. I mean, I think they're all really fascinating. Okay, couple more here. Picked up Things We Never Got Over. This is the Knockamout, which is the name of a town. series by Lucy Score. And there's a few books in this series. I believe the second book is out. The third book is coming out this fall. Small town romance. And I will say this, similar to a couple of the other romances that I've talked about earlier in this video that are kind of a little bit more complex and like there's some layers there. This one is like, I don't know, over 500 pages long. So plenty of time and space to kind of like understand these characters. But basically what ends up happening is there's a woman who's like a runaway bride, and she goes to meet up with her twin sister in the small town. And her twin sister, there's kind of like a good sister and a bad sister. The good sister is the runaway bride. The bad sister is the one who lives in the small town. The good sister gets there and realizes that the bad sister has this 11-year-old child that she didn't know about. And she has abandoned the 11-year-old child and basically like given her to the twin, the good twin, and said like, here, you raise this kid. And she's like a criminal basically and has run off into the sunset. And so she shows up in this town. She's just run away from her wedding. We don't understand why she's run away from her wedding. And now she has this 11-year-old that she's trying to take care of. And her sister has like stolen her car, stolen her purse, stolen her money, and like run away. And so she's just kind of like, all right, what am I supposed to do? And there is a man in the town who kind of comes to her rescue a little bit and kind of helps her find a place to stay and find a job and get settled a little bit in this town. Of course, a romance ensues. But in the meantime, you get this whole like extended family of this woman who kind of come into this town because they didn't realize this 11-year-old existed. You have this great story of the 11-year-old and like how she's like survived and been resilient in this situation with her mother, who's not a great person. And you have like the brother of the male main character, who is a small town police officer. And so there's all these kind of interesting kind of characters around this. I will definitely pick up the second book. I will definitely pick up the third book. So invested in all the characters. Really liked how the author like unveiled different things throughout the story, but also like added in these different character elements that were really fun. So would definitely recommend that one. Okay, and then I read the next two books in the Kyla Stone Edge of Collapse series. The first of well, this is the second book in the series, is called Edge of Madness. And then the second book in the series, or sorry, the third book technically, the second book I read is called Edge of Darkness. I think the first book was called Edge of Collapse, and I read it last month before last. Okay, this is a book about basically an electromagnetic pulse attack that knocks out like the power grid, knocks out cell phones, knocks out cars, like nothing works. I am not going to try to argue that the science is perfect, because it's probably not. And if you dig deep, I'm not sure this is like completely accurate of like what would happen. But first book is this woman who was being held captive by a man for like 5 years against her will. And when this attack happens, electricity goes out, she can escape. And so she escapes out of this like basement and is like running around in the woods of like Michigan. And then she runs into this other guy, ex-army, and he is like helping her escape. And by the way, she happens to be like 8 months pregnant. That's book number one. Book number two is the husband of the woman who was taken and kept captive, hostage by this guy. He is a small town police officer with their son. And it's basically the perspective of what happens to him when this EMP strike happens, where he's like up in a chairlift at like a ski lodge and has to like climb down somehow from this chairlift, and then is like living in a small town, and the small town is like dealing with the aftermath of this EMP strike. Now I'm on book three. After I read book three, I just finished book three, and it's rotating back and forth between these different storylines, between the small town that's like dealing with the aftermath, and between the woman who was formerly kept hostage and this man, and they're still running together. And eventually you realize her pregnancy is going to result in a birth situation, which is happening in book three. I just started book four too, so now I can't remember what's happening in the rest of the books. I'm completely sucked in, as you can tell. Great premise, super interesting. I won't say the writing is like 100% like top notch, but I don't even care. I think the plot is so fascinating, and I'm just like completely sucked in, want to know what's happening to these characters. So I'm going to probably finish out the series, I would guess, in the next month, because I've just really enjoyed it. Okay, and then the last book that I read over the course of this month was I revisited A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. Now, the last time I read this book was in like August of last year, and I I don't think I paid much attention to it. I read it on audio. I remembered like nothing from this book. And everybody has been talking again, as they always do, about this whole series and how amazing it is. And I thought, I have to read this series. I have to like understand what's going on, but I don't remember anything from this first book. So let me go back and read it again. It's not that long, you know, like I'm just gonna go back and like revisit it and kind of remind myself of like what was going on in this first book and how she was like setting up this particular series. Because right now there's 5 books in the series. There may eventually be more added on, but right now there's 5. So I just did like a quick reread of that to remind myself so that I can dive into book 2 and beyond, probably over the next month. So it's rare that I do a reread, but if it is a series book and I'm trying to kind of like reorient myself to the series, totally open to doing that because it helps me to kind of understand what's going on. Okay, those are the 34 books that I read in the month of April. Some really good ones in there, ones that I would definitely recommend. And if you want to, you can check out my May TBR video, which is going to be posted soon, where I'm going to talk about all the books I'm hoping to read in the month of May. And until then, happy reading.